Joan Hainsworth and Pat Bryan have been working in the small village of Mboka among the Narak people of the Western Highlands province of Papua New Guinea for many years, Joan in translation and Pat in literacy. They have successfully completed a New Testament translation as well as a number of shorter books with Bible segments and literacy aids. The language group spans the Jimmy River Valley, a very mountainous area. Due to the rough terrain and lack of roads, neither Joan nor Pat had ever been to the other side of the valley. Those living on the other side of the Jimmy River had been asking for books, and specifically for New Testaments. Last year, their two Narak co-workers, Moses and Peter, walked for a whole day to get down to the river and back up to the other side to the first of a series of Narak villages. Because of having to carry the heavy books, they only took 4 New Testaments with them. All 4 were sold at the first place they visited. Joan's home church in Australia agreed to partially fund another book-selling trip, and in particular agreed to finance helicopter placement of some men across the river. Pat asked Ron Rearick and Craig Campbell to accompany the 2 Narak men. This is Craig's account of the trip. September 19th. Ron and I met at the auto shop at 6:30 a.m. and stowed our personal gear in the Toyota Land Cruiser pickup truck. Ron and his son Alex had packed a lot of the construction materials the day before, including a 1,000-gallon galvanized steel water tank, roofing iron, various steel pipes, cement, and other odds and ends. A red flag was draped over the gate at the bridge leaving Ukarumpa, a reminder of rascal activity on the 10-kilometer road to Kainantu and the Highlands Highway. We had been told to expect up to a 10-hour drive to Mboka. We made good time on Sunday morning, to Goroka in less than 2 hours, over Dalo Pass to Kundiawa in Chimbu Province, then on to Bans in the Western Highlands. At Bans we left the paved road and headed into the mountains on the Jimmy Road. The road was better than expected, and after several hours of winding around hillsides, across creeks, and over ridges, past tiny villages, we came around a bend and saw Mboka, perched on a nearby ridgeline. Mboka is only about 1 kilometer from the main Jimmy Road, but it's about the steepest thing I've ever driven on in a wheeled vehicle. We drove past the turnoff and had to back up to it because it looked a lot like the rest of the hillside, not much like a road. I put the truck in low-range 4-wheel drive and inched down the hill, barely clearing the hairpin turns, and wondering how good the brakes were with all that heavy stuff in the back. At the bottom, we had to go up a short hill, and after 2 tries and a running start, we drove right up to Pat and Joan's house, arriving about 3:30 p.m. after about 280 kilometers of driving. The people of Mboka gathered in a large crowd and watched our every move as we unpacked our gear and unloaded the construction supplies into the literacy classroom, the building that also served as our bedroom for the next few days. The crowd dispersed when heavy rains began. We were thankful to have arrived safely, and we were not on the road during the rain. We enjoyed an excellent meal with Joan, Pat, and a visiting doctor from Australia named Don Lithgow. We tried to communicate by radio with our wives that night, but the reception from Ukarumpa was very poor. I discovered that my boots and water bottles had not made it into the truck during the repacking in the morning. September 20th. Joan and Pat's house had suffered during their absence and needed some work. After a quick breakfast, we dug into the task at hand with the usual crowd of spectators. We repaired part of the roof that had been damaged by a falling tree, replaced a water tank, and set new clothesline posts. By late afternoon, the storm clouds began to gather, and by evening it was pouring again. We were able to communicate by radio this night and convey the words of missing boots and water bottles to our wives, who would be coming in the next couple of days. On September 21st, we worked all morning on the clothesline and repairing the porches. That afternoon, we discussed the book distribution trek and packed for our food, books, and other gear before it became too dark, which usually happens about 6:30 p.m. here. None of us knew how long the walking trip would take, just that it would be somewhere between 3 and 5 days. September 22nd dawned clear. We were packed and ready to go, so we waited, not really sure of the helicopter's schedule. We finally did arrive about 8:50 a.m. with Hans Schuwerk, the pilot, bringing Stephanie Campbell, Deanne Rierick, and Alex Rierick, as well as my boots and water bottles. Ron, Alex, and Peter were soon off to their drop point at Talkband. Less than 15 minutes later, Hans returned, and soon Moses and I were lifting off for our drop, with Stephanie riding in the co-pilot seat. The flight was short. It was less than 10 minutes. We crossed the Jimmy River, flowing deep between jungle-clad valley walls. And all I could think of is, I've got to walk back through this. We flew past one small village, Jinnam, and continued to a point high on the flanks of Voipa Mountain. Soon we were lining up on a small clearing between the trees, perched high on the side of the valley. Children and dogs were fleeing in terror. We could see men and women watching, probably wondering what this air show was all about. As soon as we touched down, Hans opened the doors and handed us our packs. He shook my hand and said he'd pray for us, and in a moment the helicopter, Hans, Stephanie, or a vanishing speck in the distance. Meanwhile, I was thinking, wait, maybe I want to ride back, but we were committed. When the dust had settled, Moses and I began pulling out our books and spreading them on a sheet of plastic. We were in the village called Mogini, at the east end of the Narak lands. Moses began talking in Narak. When he was done, I did my best to tell what we were doing in Takpisin. Then, wonder of wonders, people began buying books and Bibles. We spent the next hour or so at our impromptu open-air bookshop until interest had waned. We were then taken to our accommodations for the night, the house of Gizpa Opens, Moses' wife's brother. Everywhere we went, we were followed by a crowd. Even in Gizpa's house, we always had a collection of his relatives in attendance. Shortly after we arrived, Moses told me that Gizpa needed some medical attention, and I became a doctor on house call. He had managed to stop a falling branch with the top of his head, and although it didn't kill him, it left a pretty good gash. I did my best to treat and bandage it. That night we had dinner and slept on the floor of Gizpa's house. On September 23rd, we arose early to an overcast morning, packed and left Mogini by 7:30 a.m. The trail contoured around the mountain for a while, then went straight down the side. The switchback is not an invention that has gained its acceptance here in Papua New Guinea, and the combination of moisture and clay made for an interesting time. The local people go everywhere barefoot and have better traction, but my bare feet wouldn't have lasted 15 minutes on that trail. At the bottom, we crossed a beautiful mountain stream, and after a brief stop, we headed straight up the opposite side of the valley. There are a few places the trail was so steep I had to climb using my hands, and in other places it just crumbled away beneath my feet, leaving nothing. We arrived in Jinnam about 11 a.m. and set up our book-selling station. It started to rain 15 minutes later, so we moved inside a small shed, along with about 20 other people, including several who were playing a card game that didn't even slow down when we arrived. We stayed in Jinnam for about 2 hours, eating lunch after the book-selling stopped, and waiting for a bit to catch our 1 p.m. radio connection with Ron and Joan. Jinnam was a bit larger than Mogini and had a school with a government-paid teacher. It had the usual card games in the village open space. Gambling is a big problem here, and the usual crowd of people hanging around, talking, watching, not doing much of anything. A man invited us to eat our lunch in his house and showed off his pet kaki, or cockatoo. After our radio contact at 1 p.m., we started the hike to Corium, arriving only an hour later. We stopped at a high point at the trail junction near the town and sold more books and awaited radio contact with Ron to find out where he was. At 3, we headed down the hill to a Nazarene church compound and met up with Ron, Peter, and Alex. After a bit more book selling, we moved into a house by the Nazarene church and spent the night there. On September 24, we left Corium about 7 a.m., heading through the jungle straight down the side of the valley toward the Jimmy River, several thousand feet below. Once again, the lug-soled boots that we wore were no match for the foot-smooth clay trails, and some of our walking companions offered to carry our packs. Putting pride aside, we took them up on the offer. At the bottom of the valley, we crossed the Jimmy River on a wire rope bridge that had seen better days and started up the other side. This was probably the hardest part of the trip, and although we appreciated the fact we were not walking in rain, the clear skies let the equatorial sun beat down on us. The jungle kept the heat in. We took several major rest stops, drinking copious amounts of water that we carried from the last stream by the river, and eating what we could to lighten our load. We finally made it back to Mboka by 2:40 p.m., exhausted but happy. Pat had made us 4 pizzas for dinner that night, and we ate it all. September 25th dawned clear in Mboka. Since we'd made the walkabout trip in less time than the ladies had thought we would, we took the opportunity to go on a book-selling tour with them to areas accessible by road. We drove out from Mboka, another exciting trip on their access road, and went to the town of Tabibuka. We dropped Pat here to sell books and continued on towards Singoropo. We went as far as the road would let us. Even in a four-wheel drive vehicle, the road was marginal, and we stopped a bit short of our goal. Both Joan and Pat did a great business in book sales, though, and it was well worth the effort. On September 26th, I attended the church at Mboka, the Church of the Nazarene, and Ron and Alex went just down the trail a ways to the Lutheran church. The only notable thing that morning was the cassowary bird that wandered in and out of the service. On September 27th, we headed home. We had one more incredibly exciting ride up the Mboka access road, which was a bit of an obstacle course between the erosion ruts and the people who didn't know enough to get out of our way. If we had stopped, we would have had to back all the way down to the bottom again. We did have some incidents on the trip home, but we did make it safely home that afternoon, back to Ukarumpa. Pat and Joan had had misgivings about trying to organize this trip. They hadn't had contact with the village for over 9 months. They didn't know if Peter and Moses would be available to make the trip. There's no way to get word to those on the other side of the river valley to set things up. There's no mail service, no radio communication or telephone into the area. But they went ahead and planned it anyway, booked a helicopter and the truck, and prayed things would come together. This short trip to the Narak language area is just a small part of the many years of effort that have gone into bringing the gospel to the Narak people. At the end of our trip, 270 books had been sold, including 29 New Testaments, by the several people involved: Ron, myself, Alex, Pat, and Joan. In the context of the Narak language area, this is a significant number. We hope that through the efforts of all involved, through the hard work of Joan and Pat, and through the financial contributions of many individuals and churches, another seed has been planted for spiritual growth among these people.